Cop drags wrong black woman to court. 5 minutes later, learns she's the chief federal prosecutor. On an ordinary day in the heart of Chicago, a black woman finds herself dragged to court by an arrogant cop. To him, she's just another face, another person he can intimidate. But what he doesn't realize is that the woman he's mistreated holds more power than he could ever imagine. 5 minutes into the hearing, his world crumbles when her true identity is revealed. She's the chief federal prosecutor, and she's about to turn the tables in a way he never saw coming. The late afternoon sun filtered through the bustling streets of downtown Chicago, casting a warm glow over the iconic skyline. Brianna Milton adjusted her rearview mirror, her eyes scanning the crowded traffic ahead. She had just finished a long meeting at the Richard J. Daley Center, her day packed with high-profile discussions on federal cases involving corporate fraud and civil rights violations. It was a day like any other for her, a whirlwind of paperwork, courtroom deliberations, and high-stakes decisions. Yet she always made time to center herself, a habit she'd carried from her years as a law student navigating the chaos of her early career. She hummed softly to herself, the calming strains of Nina Simone playing through her car's speakers, when the sharp wail of a police siren shattered the tranquility. Her brow furrowed as she glanced in the rearview mirror. A police cruiser had pulled up behind her, lights flashing insistently. Confused, Brianna signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. The officer stepped out of his car with an air of authority. His polished boots clicked loudly against the pavement as he approached her vehicle. Brianna rolled down her window, keeping her hands firmly on the wheel, her movements deliberate. She had seen enough in her career to know how these situations could escalate unnecessarily. License and registration. The officer barked, his tone brusque and impatient. His name tag read Baker, and his eyes flickered with suspicion as he leaned slightly forward to peer into her car. Brianna offered a polite smile as she handed over the requested documents. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask what this is about?" Baker ignored her question, his eyes darting between her face and the stack of folders sitting on the passenger seat. "Do you know how fast you were going?" he asked, his voice laced with condescension. Brianna blinked, caught off guard. "I was well within the speed limit. Is there something else I need to be aware of?" Her calm and measured tone seemed to irritate Baker further. He stepped back, glancing at her license before narrowing his eyes. "You seem awfully defensive for someone getting pulled over." Brianna felt a flicker of unease, but maintained her composure. "I'm simply trying to understand the nature of the stop." Baker scoffed. "Step out of the car." Her breath caught in her chest. She had represented countless victims of unjust traffic stops, instances where minor infractions spiraled into life-altering encounters. Now, she found herself on the other side of the scenario, the irony bitter in her mind. Still, she complied, unbuckling her seatbelt and stepping out of the car with a quiet grace that belied her rising frustration. As she stood on the sidewalk, Baker towered over her, his posture brimming with unnecessary aggression. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, his voice loud enough to attract the attention of a few pedestrians nearby. Brianna noticed their glances, some curious, others wary, but none stopped to intervene. "Officer," she began, keeping her voice steady, "I've cooperated fully. Can you explain why I've been asked to step out of the car?" Baker smirked, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "You're obstructing justice, and now you're resisting a lawful stop." Her jaw tightened. The accusations were absurd, but she knew better than to argue. "I'm not resisting anything. I've complied with all your instructions." "That's not what it looks like to me," Baker snapped, reaching for his handcuffs. Without warning, he grabbed her arm and yanked it behind her back. The harsh metal of the cuffs bit into her wrists, and Brianna inhaled sharply, suppressing a wave of anger. "This is completely unnecessary," she said, her voice low but firm. "You're making a mistake." Baker's grin widened as he tightened the cuffs. "The only mistake here is thinking you can talk your way out of this." Brianna's eyes locked onto his, her calm demeanor unwavering despite the humiliation of being handcuffed in public. "Officer Baker, I strongly suggest you reconsider your actions." Her tone was no longer polite. It carried a quiet authority that gave Baker pause for the briefest of moments before he scoffed. "Save it for the judge." As Brianna was pushed into the back seat of the cruiser, she took a steadying breath. This wasn't her first encounter with arrogance and abuse of power, but it was her first time being on the receiving end. She glanced out the window as the city blurred past, her mind already calculating her next move. Baker, seated in the front, seemed all too pleased with himself, chuckling under his breath as he called in the arrest over his radio. "Got one resisting over here," he said casually. "We'll add obstruction and noncompliance to the list." Brianna closed her eyes briefly, her mind replaying every moment of the interaction. She knew how to handle this. She'd spent her career dismantling cases like this one, and now she had a chance to show Baker and everyone else what true accountability looked like. The police cruiser pulled up to the courthouse, and Baker opened the door with exaggerated flair, pulling Brianna out by her arm. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she steadied herself, standing tall despite the cuffs on her wrists. "You'll have your day in court," Baker sneered, leading her toward the entrance. Brianna turned to him, her expression calm, but her eyes fierce. "You have no idea what you've just done." Baker rolled his eyes, dismissing her words, but for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. It would be the last moment of confidence he'd feel for a long time. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse creaked open as Brianna Milton was led inside, her calm demeanor masking the simmering storm beneath the surface. The grand hall buzzed with the quiet murmurs of attorneys, clerks, and visitors going about their day, none of them aware of the drama about to unfold. The polished marble floors gleamed under the afternoon sunlight streaming through the high windows, but for Brianna, the familiar environment of the courthouse now carried a strange and bitter weight. Officer Baker strutted through the hall, his grip firm on Brianna's arm as though parading her as a trophy of his perceived authority. She felt the curious stares of bystanders as they passed. Some glanced at her with pity, others with a fleeting disinterest that came from seeing too many faces pass through the justice system. But Brianna held her head high, her expression unreadable. The walk to the courtroom felt both endless and surreal. Brianna could hear the faint click of her heels against the marble, a steady rhythm that echoed louder in her mind than Baker's boastful voice. "This one's going to be easy," Baker said, smirking as he spoke to another officer stationed near the courtroom doors. Caught her in the act, resisting, obstructing, thought she could mouth off and walk away. The other officer gave a half-hearted nod, clearly uninterested in Baker's theatrics. Brianna noticed his averted gaze and stiff posture. Not everyone in law enforcement carried Baker's bravado. She knew that much from experience, but it wasn't enough to soothe the growing knot in her chest. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, their dark wood engraved with intricate designs, a solemn reminder of the weight of justice. Baker shoved them open, leading Brianna inside with a flourish. The room was almost empty, save for the clerk, a court reporter, and a handful of attorneys preparing for their cases. At the far end of the room, Judge Susan Finley sat behind the bench, her sharp eyes scanning a stack of papers. Judge Finley was a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, her silver-streaked hair pulled back into a neat bun. She was known for her razor-sharp intellect and an unyielding commitment to fairness. Brianna had appeared before her many times, in her role as chief federal prosecutor, but today, Finley's expression betrayed no sign of recognition as her eyes flickered toward the commotion at the door. Baker marched Brianna to the defendant's table, his chest puffed out like a rooster in full display. He gestured toward her as if presenting a prize. "Resisting arrest and obstruction of justice, Your Honor," he declared, his voice loud and self-assured. Judge Finley's gaze shifted to Brianna, her piercing eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the woman standing before her. There was a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, but she remained silent, turning her attention instead to Baker's statement. Brianna said nothing as Baker recounted his version of events, painting her as combative and unruly. She let him speak, watching him dig himself deeper with each exaggerated claim. Her silence wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a calculated choice, a moment to gather her thoughts and let the absurdity of his accusations fully unfold. Judge Finley leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled as she listened. When Baker finished, she glanced down at the documents he had hastily provided. Her eyes scanned Brianna's license, then flicked back to the prosecutor's table where Brianna stood tall, despite the cuffs still binding her wrists. "Officer Baker," the judge began, her tone measured but laced with an undercurrent of skepticism. "This defendant appears unusually calm for someone you claim was aggressively resisting." Baker hesitated for a fraction of a second before recovering. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Some people are just good at hiding their true nature. Brianna suppressed the urge to smirk at his flimsy defense. Instead, she remained stoic, her calm demeanor an unspoken challenge to his authority. Judge Finley, however, was not so easily convinced. She leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing further. "Miss Milton," the judge said, her tone softening ever so slightly. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Brianna lifted her chin, her voice steady as she spoke. "Yes, Your Honor. If I may, I'd like to make a brief statement." Baker let out a derisive snort, muttering under his breath, "Here we go." Judge Finley shot him a warning glance, silencing him instantly. "Proceed," she said, gesturing for Brianna to speak. Brianna took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto the judge's. Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of someone accustomed to commanding attention in a courtroom. "Your Honor, the events described by Officer Baker are not only exaggerated but entirely fabricated. I complied fully with his instructions and was met with unwarranted aggression. This is not the first time I've encountered cases like this in my line of work, but it is the first time I've experienced it personally." Baker's smirk faltered, his confidence wavering as her words hung in the air. The quiet power in her tone sent a ripple of unease through the room. Judge Finley's eyes flicked back to the documents in front of her, her expression tightening as she scanned Brianna's name once more. Something clicked, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She straightened in her seat, her demeanor shifting from neutral to commanding. "Officer Baker," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you aware of the defendant's full name and credentials?" Baker blinked, confusion clouding his face. "Credentials? What does that have to do with anything?" "She broke the law." "Answer the question," the judge snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. Baker stammered, glancing at Brianna as if seeing her for the first time. I know her name, Your Honor. I didn't think it was relevant." Judge Finley leaned forward, her eyes boring into him. "Then allow me to enlighten you. You have just arrested and brought to my courtroom Brianna Milton, the chief federal prosecutor for the Northern District of Illinois." The room fell into stunned silence. Baker's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The weight of the revelation crashed over him, and for the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. Brianna remained silent, her expression unreadable as she watched the realization dawn on him. She wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent, the kind of silence that carried the weight of unspoken judgment. Baker's once confident posture had wilted, his shoulders hunched as Judge Susan Finley's words echoed through the room. "Brianna Milton, chief federal prosecutor." The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap, rippling through every corner of the courtroom. Brianna stood motionless, her calm demeanor unwavering, though her mind was already piecing together the steps she would take next. She had spent years in rooms just like this one, dismantling the defense of individuals who thought their arrogance or authority would shield them from accountability. Today, however, the personal sting of injustice fueled her in ways she hadn't expected. Judge Finley's voice sliced through the tension, cold and deliberate. "Officer Baker, step forward." Baker hesitated, his feet suddenly rooted to the floor as though moving closer to the bench would seal his fate. The judge's piercing gaze narrowed further, and with an almost imperceptible shake of her head, she gestured firmly. "Now." Reluctantly, Baker shuffled forward, his boots scuffing the floor as he avoided looking at Brianna. He had walked into this courtroom just minutes ago with a swagger and a smirk, but now his confidence had evaporated. His face was pale, his hands fidgeting with the edges of his belt as he came to a stop in front of the judge's bench. "You mean to tell me," Judge Finley began, her words slow and deliberate, "that you not only arrested one of the highest-ranking legal officials in this state without cause, but that you did so without bothering to confirm her identity?" Baker opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. His mind scrambled for an explanation, any explanation that might justify his actions. But what excuse could he offer? That he had let his ego get the better of him? That he had acted out of prejudice rather than reason? None of it would save him now. Your Honor," he finally stammered, his voice unsteady. "I didn't know." "That much is painfully obvious," the judge interrupted, her tone sharp and unforgiving. "Ignorance is not a defense, Officer Baker, not in this courtroom, and certainly not in the eyes of the law." Brianna watched him flounder, her expression impassive. This was a man who had used his badge as a weapon, who had allowed his unchecked authority to dictate his actions, and now he was crumbling under the weight of the very system he had abused. "Miss Milton," Judge Finley said, turning her attention to Brianna. Her tone softened slightly, but it retained its authority. "Is there anything you'd like to add before I proceed?" Brianna stepped forward, her wrists still bound by the handcuffs Baker had so carelessly slapped on her. She tilted her head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Yes, Your Honor, I'd like these removed, if you don't mind." The judge's eyes flicked to Baker, who fumbled awkwardly with the keys on his belt. His hands trembled as he approached Brianna, his earlier arrogance replaced with a visible unease. The sound of the cuffs clicking open was almost cathartic, a small but significant symbol of the power shift that had just occurred. "Thank you," Brianna said coolly, rubbing her wrists before returning her gaze to the judge. "Your Honor, I have no intention of letting this matter slide. Officer Baker's actions today were not just a violation of my rights. They were a clear abuse of power, and they reflect a deeper systemic issue that cannot be ignored." The judge nodded solemnly. "I understand. Please continue." Brianna's voice grew firmer, carrying the weight of her conviction. "This is not about me. This is about the countless individuals who don't have the platform or the privilege to stand up to this kind of behavior. If Officer Baker was willing to act this way towards someone like me, with my title and my resources, imagine what he's done to others who lack those protections." Baker flinched at her words, his gaze fixed on the floor. The courtroom, once bustling with quiet murmurs, was now entirely still. Even the clerks had paused their work, their attention fixed on the unfolding drama. "I will be filing a formal complaint with the Department of Justice," Brianna continued, her tone measured but unyielding, "and I will personally ensure that this case is reviewed by Internal Affairs. It's time for accountability to mean something." Judge Finley leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable for a moment. The room felt suspended in time, the gravity of Brianna's words hanging in the air like a storm cloud about to break. "Very well," the judge said finally, her voice calm but resolute. "Officer Baker, effective immediately, you are suspended from duty pending a full investigation into your actions. I will also be issuing a formal recommendation to your department that this matter be referred to the state's attorney for potential criminal charges." Baker's head snapped up, his face a mask of shock and desperation. "Your Honor, please, enough." The judge cut him off, her tone icy. "You have shown a blatant disregard for the law and for the rights of the citizens you are sworn to protect. There is no excuse for that." Brianna stood silently, her gaze fixed on Baker as he stumbled back toward the defendant's table. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated shell of a man who had finally been forced to confront the consequences of his actions. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, Brianna turned to leave the courtroom, the weight of the moment settling over her, a mixture of vindication and exhaustion. This was only the beginning. There would be hearings, investigations, and public scrutiny to follow, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Outside the courthouse, the sun had begun to set, casting the city in a warm, golden glow. Brianna paused on the steps, taking a deep breath of the cool evening air. She had faced countless battles in her career, but this one felt different. It was personal, and it wasn't over yet. Brianna Milton descended the steps of the courthouse slowly, her heels clicking rhythmically against the worn stone. The orange hues of the setting sun streaked the Chicago skyline, casting long shadows on the bustling streets below. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, exhaling deeply, as if the weight of the day was finally lifting, if only slightly. She turned her face upward, letting the cool breeze brush against her skin. Her calm exterior gave little away, but inside, her mind was already racing with the work ahead. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a call to action, a stark reminder of the system's flaws and the unchecked power that officers like Baker had grown far too comfortable wielding. A voice broke through her thoughts. "Miss Milton." It was a young clerk from the courtroom, his arms laden with a stack of legal papers. He was out of breath as he jogged toward her. "Yes?" she replied, her tone measured but kind. "These are for you." He handed over a folder, his eyes betraying a mixture of awe and nervousness. "Judge Finley thought you might need these for your next steps." Brianna took the folder, flipping it open briefly to scan the contents. It contained Officer Baker's full disciplinary record, one that was far more extensive than she'd anticipated. There were multiple complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct, most of which had been quietly dismissed or buried under bureaucratic red tape. Her jaw tightened as she closed the folder. "Thank you," she said softly, her mind already turning over the implications. "This will be helpful." The clerk hesitated, his curiosity evident. "Miss Milton, I just wanted to say, what you did in there, it was inspiring. People like him, they think they're untouchable. It's good to see someone standing up to them." Brianna gave him a small smile, the first genuine one of the day. "Thank you, but this isn't about just standing up to one person. It's about changing the entire system. Keep that in mind." The clerk nodded, his admiration clear, as he hurried back into the courthouse. Brianna glanced at the folder again, her grip tightening. The complaints were damning, but they also told a larger story, one of a system that enabled and protected people like Baker. As Brianna walked to her car, parked a few blocks away, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a familiar name flashing on the screen, Clara Lewis, her closest friend and a fellow prosecutor, who had always been her sounding board during difficult cases. Brianna answered, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder as she unlocked her car. "Clara, I just heard," Clara said without preamble, her voice sharp with concern. "Are you okay?" Brianna let out a soft laugh, though it lacked humor. "I'm fine. A little rattled, maybe, but fine." "I can't believe Baker had the audacity," Clara cut herself off, exhaling loudly. "No, actually I can. He's always been a loose cannon. How is he still on the force?" Brianna slid into the driver's seat, tossing the folder onto the passenger seat before leaning back against the headrest. "That's the question, isn't it? There are too many people like him, and there are too many systems that protect them." Clara's voice softened. "What's your next move?" Brianna stared out the windshield, the city alive with the sound of car horns and distant chatter. "First, I'll file my complaint with the DOJ. Then, I'll make sure his record gets a proper review. If there's any justice in this world, he won't wear a badge again." "You're taking this personally, aren't you?" Clara asked gently. Brianna closed her eyes for a moment, letting the question settle. "How could I not? I've spent my career fighting for people who didn't have the power to fight for themselves, and today I saw firsthand what they go through, what I've been fighting against. It's not just a case, Clara, it's a responsibility." Clara was quiet for a moment, her silence filled with understanding. "You'll make it right," she said finally. "You always do." Brianna smiled faintly. "Thanks, Clara. I'll talk to you later." She ended the call and started the car, the engine purring to life, but she didn't drive off immediately. Instead, she sat there, her hands resting on the steering wheel, her mind replaying the events of the day, Baker's arrogance, the humiliation of being handcuffed, the weight of the system that allowed it all to happen. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. She opened it and scanned the subject line. "Internal Affairs, Request for Statement, Officer Baker Investigation." It was starting already. Good. Brianna tightened her grip on the wheel, her resolve solidifying. This wasn't over. Baker's actions were just the tip of the iceberg, and she intended to expose everything beneath the surface. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but if there was one thing Brianna Milton knew how to do, it was fight for justice. With a determined breath, she shifted the car into drive and pulled onto the street. The city stretched out before her, its towering buildings silhouetted against the fading light. Somewhere out there, others were experiencing the same kind of injustice she had faced today, and she would make sure that their voices, like hers, would finally be heard. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of Brianna Milton's apartment, painting long streaks of gold across the hardwood floors. The faint hum of the city outside filtered in, a steady rhythm of honking horns, footsteps, and distant chatter. Brianna sat at her kitchen table, the remnants of a half-eaten bagel pushed to the side. Her focus was on the laptop in front of her, the cursor blinking on a blank email draft. Her coffee sat untouched, its warmth long faded. She glanced at the subject line of her email, "Formal complaint submission, Officer Baker, misconduct." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the weight of her words pressing down on her more than she expected. Brianna wasn't a stranger to filing complaints against officers who abused their power. As chief federal prosecutor, she'd overseen countless investigations into misconduct, but this time it was different. This time, It wasn't just a case in a file. It was her name, her dignity, and her experience etched into every word she would write. The thought fueled her resolve. She began typing, her words precise and deliberate. To whom it may concern, on insert date, I was subjected to an unlawful arrest by Officer Baker of the Chicago Police Department. The details of this incident, as outlined below, demonstrate not only a blatant misuse of power, but also a disturbing pattern of behavior consistent with systemic issues within the department. Her fingers flew across the keys, her anger channeling into the formal language she had perfected over the years. She described the arrest in painstaking detail, the unnecessary aggression, the fabricated charges, the public humiliation. She cited specific legal precedents and departmental guidelines that Baker had violated, weaving a case so airtight that it would be impossible to ignore. When she finished, she sat back and reread the email, her eyes scanning for any gaps or weaknesses. Satisfied, she hit send. The email disappeared into the ether, and with it, the first step toward accountability had been taken. The rest of the day was a blur of meetings and phone calls, each one punctuated by the shadow of the previous day's events. As much as Brianna tried to focus on her other cases, the weight of Baker's actions lingered in her mind. The system was flawed, that much she had always known, but experiencing its failures firsthand had given her a clarity she hadn't expected. It was late afternoon when her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Brianna hesitated for a moment before answering. "This is Milton. Miss Milton, this is Captain Lopez from the Chicago Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. Do you have a moment to discuss your complaint against Officer Baker?" Brianna straightened in her chair, her voice steady. "I do. What's the status of the investigation?" Lopez cleared his throat, his tone professional but cautious. "We've reviewed the initial evidence you provided, including Officer Baker's body cam footage, and we find it concerning. We've placed him on administrative leave while we conduct a thorough investigation." Brianna's heart quickened. "And what about his record? There are multiple complaints against him that were previously dismissed. Will those be reopened?" "Yes, ma'am. We flagged his entire file for review. If we find any evidence of negligence or cover-ups, those responsible will be held accountable as well." Brianna leaned back, a small sense of relief washing over her. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate the urgency with which you're handling this." "It's the least we can do," Lopez replied, a hint of sincerity breaking through his formal tone. "We'll keep you updated as the investigation progresses." After the call ended, Brianna allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Baker's suspension was only the first step in a much larger battle, but it was a step in the right direction. She knew that systemic change didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, grueling process that required persistence and an unwavering commitment to justice. That evening, Brianna sat in her living room, the city lights flickering through the large windows. A folder lay open on the coffee table, its contents spilling out in a chaotic heap. It was Baker's disciplinary record, along with notes and documents from similar cases she had handled in the past. Each page told a story of unchecked power, of lives disrupted or destroyed by those sworn to protect them. She picked up one of the papers, her eyes scanning the details of a complaint filed by a young man named Marco Ellis. He had been stopped by Baker on suspicion of car theft, despite being the registered owner of the vehicle. The case had been dismissed for lack of evidence, but Brianna could read between the lines. It wasn't lack of evidence, it was lack of will to pursue justice. Her jaw tightened as she flipped through more pages. A single name kept appearing in the dismissed complaints, Sergeant Paul Foster. He was Baker's supervisor, and from what Brianna could gather, he had been instrumental in burying the complaints against his officers. If Baker was the symptom, Foster was part of the disease. Brianna's phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Clara. "How's the fight going?" Clara asked, her tone light but tinged with concern. Brianna sighed. "It's going. Baker's been suspended, but his supervisor, Sergeant Foster, seems to be the one pulling the strings. He's protected Baker and others like him for years. So what's the plan?" Brianna leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "I'm going to dig. If Foster has been complicit in covering up misconduct, I'll make sure he faces the consequences too. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about the culture that allows them to thrive." Clara was silent for a moment before she spoke. "You know this won't be easy, right?" Foster is going to fight you every step of the way. Brianna's lips curved into a faint smile, one that carried both determination and a hint of weariness. I know, but I've never been one to back down from a fight. She ended the call and stared at the scattered papers on the table, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just a case. It was a mission. Baker's actions were the spark, but the fire had been smoldering beneath the surface for years, and now it was time to burn through the lies, the corruption, and the complacency. Brianna reached for a pen and a notepad, her mind already racing with strategies. The road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but she was ready. Because justice wasn't just her job, it was her purpose. The air in Brianna Milton's apartment was thick with quiet focus, interrupted only by the faint rustle of papers as she sifted through Baker's disciplinary record. The dim overhead light cast long shadows across the table where her notes sprawled in every direction, a mix of case summaries, highlighted complaints, and legal references. Her laptop screen glowed faintly, displaying an open database query that she had been combing through for hours. The deeper she dug, the clearer the pattern became. Baker wasn't operating in isolation. The complaints against him didn't just point to one rogue officer. They revealed a culture of complicity within his precinct. The same names appeared over and over. Sergeant Paul Foster as the supervisor and a handful of officers whose misconduct had been quietly dismissed or ignored. Brianna leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as fatigue settled in. Her phone buzzed on the table, startling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Captain Lopez. Captain, she answered, her voice calm but edged with curiosity. Miss Milton, Lopez began, his tone measured but heavy. I thought you'd want to know. Baker's suspension is already stirring up trouble within the department. Brianna sat up straighter, her brow furrowing. What kind of trouble? Lopez sighed. The sound weighted with frustration. Pushback. Some officers are claiming Baker's being unfairly targeted. A few have even hinted at filing a grievance against the investigation. And then there's Foster. He's not happy about any of this. Brianna's lips pressed into a thin line. I assume Foster is making his displeasure known loudly. Lopez admitted, he's been questioning my decisions in front of the rank and file, undermining the process. He even called a meeting with the union rep this morning, trying to paint this as some kind of witch hunt. Brianna closed her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply to steady herself. None of this surprised her. People like Foster thrived on creating smokescreens, deflecting attention from their own culpability by framing accountability as persecution. It was an old tactic, but a dangerous one. Let him push, she said finally, her voice firm. The evidence speaks for itself. Baker's body cam footage alone is damning, and his record is a laundry list of misconduct. Foster can call it whatever he wants, but the facts won't change. Lopez hesitated before responding. I respect what you're doing, Miss Milton, but be careful. Foster isn't just protecting Baker. He's protecting himself. If you keep digging, you'll find things he doesn't want anyone to see, and he knows it. Brianna's grip on the phone tightened, her jaw clenching at the veiled warning. I didn't take this job to make friends, Captain. I took it to hold people accountable. If Foster is part of the problem, I'll make sure he's dealt with. There was a pause on the other end before Lopez replied, his tone softer. Just watch your back. People like Foster don't play fair. I always do, Brianna said, ending the call. The hours bled into one another as Brianna continued her investigation. She requested additional files from the DOJ database, cross-referenced Baker's past complaints with other officers in the precinct, and uncovered a startling trend. Nearly all of the complaints filed against Baker and his peers had been marked as resolved internally under Foster's supervision. But what caught her attention most was a specific incident buried deep in Baker's record, one that stood out from the others. A young woman named Lisa Blake had filed a complaint 5 years earlier, claiming that Baker and 2 other officers had unlawfully detained her, confiscated her phone, and erased footage she had recorded of their behavior. The case had been closed without further investigation, with a note citing insufficient evidence. Brianna's pulse quickened as she read Lisa's statement, which had been tucked away in the appendices of the report. The young woman had described feeling powerless and humiliated, her voice dismissed by those sworn to protect her. It was a familiar story, one Brianna had heard too many times before, but this time she had the tools to make sure it wasn't ignored. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Clara. You're still at it, aren't you? Get some sleep before you collapse. Brianna smirked, her friend's concern a welcome reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in this fight. She typed back a quick reply. Can't stop now. I think I found the thread that unravels the whole thing. The next morning, Brianna arrived at her office downtown, a nondescript building tucked between the towering skyscrapers of Chicago's financial district. Her assistant, Maya, greeted her at the door with a stack of documents and a concerned expression. Good morning, Miss Milton. I flagged a few things you should see, Maya said, following Brianna into her office. There's been chatter about Foster. Word is he's doubling down on defending Baker, and he's already trying to discredit you. Brianna set her bag down and took the stack of papers from Maya, flipping through them. They were reports from local news outlets, some already speculating about the controversy surrounding Baker's suspension. Foster's fingerprints were all over the narrative, with anonymous quotes describing the investigation as politically motivated and unfair to hard-working officers. Brianna dropped the papers onto her desk with a frustrated sigh. He's trying to control the narrative before the facts come out. Classic. Maya hesitated before speaking. There's more. I got a call from Lisa Blake this morning. She saw your name in connection to Baker's suspension and wanted to talk. Brianna froze, her eyes narrowing. Lisa Blake, the woman from the erased footage case. Maya nodded. She said she's ready to tell her story. She's been waiting for someone to take this seriously. A spark of determination flared in Brianna's chest. Get her on the phone. Set up a meeting as soon as possible. By the afternoon, Brianna found herself sitting across from Lisa in a small conference room. The young woman was in her late 20s now, her expression a mixture of nervousness and defiance. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her jacket, but her eyes met Brianna's with unwavering intensity. Thank you for meeting with me, Brianna began, her tone warm but professional. I know this isn't easy. Lisa nodded, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. I've been waiting 5 years for someone to listen. Brianna leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. I'm listening, and this time, we'll make sure your story isn't buried. Lisa's eyes glistened as she began to speak, recounting the night Baker and his colleagues had detained her, the fear she had felt as they erased the evidence she thought would protect her, and the hopelessness of seeing her complaint dismissed without a second glance. As Lisa's story unfolded, Brianna's resolve only deepened. This wasn't just about Baker or Foster. It was about every person whose voice had been silenced by the very institutions meant to protect them. And Brianna would make sure those voices were heard. The hum of the small conference room faded into silence as Lisa Blake finished her story. Her hands, which had trembled at the start, were now gripping her knees, her knuckles white with tension. Her eyes were fixed on the table, but her voice, steady and raw, still lingered in the air. Brianna Milton sat across from her, a deep furrow etched between her brows. The details Lisa had shared painted a chilling picture. A coordinated effort by Officer Baker and his colleagues to silence her, followed by the deliberate erasure of evidence that could have exposed their misconduct. Lisa's courage to speak out, despite being dismissed and ignored for years, struck a chord in Brianna that went beyond her usual drive for justice. Lisa, Brianna said softly, leaning forward, thank you for sharing all of this with me. I know how hard it must be to relive those moments. Lisa's gaze lifted slowly, meeting Brianna's. You're the first person who's actually cared enough to listen. I almost didn't call. I thought, what's the point? There's always a point, Brianna replied firmly. Your story matters, and it's not just about what happened to you. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Lisa nodded, her expression shifting from guarded to resolute. If this can help stop him, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Brianna pulled out a notepad and began jotting down key points from Lisa's account. We're going to reopen your case, she said decisively. Baker and Foster covered this up, but now we have the leverage to dig deeper. Your testimony, combined with the evidence I've already gathered, could expose a much larger pattern of misconduct. Lisa exhaled shakily, as though a weight had lifted from her shoulders. What happens next? Brianna set down her pen and folded her hands on the table. Next, we bring this to internal affairs. Your case will add to the pressure already mounting against Baker. But more importantly, it will shine a light on Foster and the culture he's fostered in that precinct. Lisa hesitated, then asked, do you think they'll actually face consequences? I've seen these things get swept under the rug too many times. Brianna's jaw tightened, her voice hardening with conviction. Not this time. I won't let that happen. Later that evening, Brianna returned to her office. The city lights twinkled outside her window, but her focus was on the files spread across her desk. Lisa's testimony had opened a floodgate of questions, each one demanding answers. She picked up her phone and dialed Captain Lopez's number. He answered after a few rings, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Miss Milton, I wasn't expecting to hear from you again so soon. I just finished meeting with Lisa Blake," Brianna said without preamble. Her case wasn't just a one-off. It's part of a larger pattern, one that Foster has been actively covering up. There was a pause on the other end before Lopez sighed. "I was afraid of that. What did she tell you?" Brianna relayed the details of Lisa's story, including the erased footage and the dismissive response to her complaint. By the time she finished, Lopez's tone had shifted from tired to grim. "This goes deeper than I thought," he admitted. "If Foster has been burying complaints, that means he's not just protecting Baker. He's protecting the entire precinct's reputation. And that's exactly why we need to act now," Brianna said firmly. "I'm filing a motion to reopen Lisa's case, and I want internal affairs to prioritize it." "I'll make sure it happens," Lopez promised. "But you should know, Foster is already feeling the heat. He's been calling in favors, trying to rally support from higher-ups." Brianna smirked, her voice tinged with determination. "Let him try. The more he resists, the more obvious his guilt becomes." The following morning, Brianna arrived at the courthouse early, armed with a stack of documents and a renewed sense of purpose. Maya was waiting for her in the office, a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. "Good news," Maya said as Brianna stepped inside. "I pulled some strings with our DOJ contacts, and they've expedited access to additional records from Foster's precinct. You're going to want to see this." Brianna set her things down and opened the folder Maya handed her. Inside were copies of internal memos, complaint logs, and disciplinary reports. At first glance, the documents appeared routine, but as Brianna dug deeper, a troubling pattern emerged. "Look at this," Brianna said, pointing to a series of entries in the complaint log. These cases were all dismissed under Foster's supervision, often for insufficient evidence. But the original reports suggest there was plenty of evidence. Witness statements, corroborating footage, even physical injuries. Maya leaned over, her eyes scanning the highlighted sections. It's like they were deliberately closing cases to protect their own. "Exactly," Brianna said, her tone sharp. "Foster isn't just complicit. He's orchestrating this." Her phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from Lisa. "Thank you for believing me. Let me know what I can do to help." Brianna's expression softened. She typed back quickly. "You've already helped more than you know. I'll keep you updated." The days that followed were a blur of meetings, filings, and mounting tension. Brianna Milton moved with purpose, balancing her regular caseload with the growing investigation into Officer Baker and Sergeant Foster. Every step forward brought more resistance, but it also unearthed more damning evidence. The web of corruption in Foster's precinct was deeper than even Brianna had anticipated. Internal Affairs had escalated their audit of the precinct, uncovering a disturbing pattern of dismissed complaints and altered reports. Foster, once untouchable, was now the focus of a widening investigation. Baker, meanwhile, had gone silent, his brash confidence replaced by mounting fear. Brianna stood in her office one evening, staring at a whiteboard covered with notes, names, and arrows connecting the pieces of the puzzle. Maya entered quietly, carrying a fresh cup of coffee. "You're still at it," Maya said, setting the cup down on the desk. "Do you ever stop?" Brianna glanced at her assistant, exhaustion tugging at the edges of her sharp gaze. "I'll stop when it's done." Maya nodded, folding her arms. Internal Affairs sent over their preliminary report. "It's bad, worse than we thought." Brianna turned to the report Maya handed her, flipping through its pages. The findings were damning. Foster had overseen the dismissal of over 30 complaints in the past 5 years, most involving officers under his direct supervision. Several cases had evidence of tampering, including deleted footage and coerced witness statements. "They're recommending criminal charges against Foster," Maya continued, "and Baker's facing charges for misconduct and abuse of power." Brianna exhaled, the weight of progress settling on her shoulders. "Good, but it's not enough." Maya raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Brianna's expression hardened. "It's not just about the charges. It's about making sure this never happens again. We need systemic changes, policies that prevent people like Foster and Baker from hiding behind bureaucracy. The courthouse was packed for the hearing. News of the investigation had spread, drawing reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. Brianna entered the courtroom with her usual poise, her briefcase in hand, and her mind razor-sharp. Baker sat at the defendant's table, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. Foster was seated behind him, his face a mask of defiance. Despite the growing evidence against him, he clung to the belief that his connections and reputation would shield him. As the proceedings began, Brianna presented her case with precision. She laid out the evidence against Baker, including the body cam footage from her arrest and Lisa Blake's testimony. The room was silent as the footage played, showing Baker's unwarranted aggression and fabrication of charges. When Brianna called Lisa to the stand, the young woman spoke with quiet strength, recounting her experience and the impact it had on her life. Her testimony was a turning point, drawing visible reactions from the audience, and even some of the officers present. Foster's attorney attempted to deflect blame, arguing that the dismissed complaints were procedural errors rather than intentional misconduct. But Brianna dismantled his arguments with ease, citing the patterns of tampering and cover-ups documented in the Internal Affairs report. When Brianna delivered her closing argument, her voice resonated with conviction. This is not just about one officer or one supervisor. This is about a system that has failed the very people it was meant to protect. We cannot allow these abuses of power to continue unchecked. Justice demands accountability, and today, we have the opportunity to begin making things right. The judge's decision was swift. Baker was found guilty of misconduct and abuse of power, facing criminal charges and the permanent revocation of his badge. Foster, too, was indicted, his years of corruption laid bare for all to see. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the sentences were announced, but Brianna remained composed, her victory tempered by the knowledge that the fight for systemic change was far from over. The fallout from the trial was immediate. Foster's indictment triggered a wave of audits across the city, exposing similar patterns of misconduct in other precincts. The mayor's office issued a statement promising comprehensive reforms, including the implementation of stricter oversight and accountability measures. Brianna became a prominent voice in the push for change, her story drawing national attention. Interviews and speaking engagements followed, but she remained focused on her work, ensuring that the momentum didn't wane. Lisa Blake's courage inspired others to come forward, their voices adding to the growing demand for justice. Brianna worked tirelessly to support them, knowing that their stories were the foundation of the movement she had inadvertently ignited. One evening, as Brianna walked out of the courthouse, she spotted Lisa waiting by the steps. The young woman smiled, her expression filled with gratitude. "You did it," Lisa said. "We did it," Brianna corrected, her voice warm. "Your courage made this possible." Lisa nodded, her gaze steady. "Thank you for believing in me." Brianna placed a hand on Lisa's shoulder, her voice firm but kind. "Never stop believing in yourself. You have more power than you know." Months later, Brianna stood in front of a packed auditorium, delivering a keynote speech at a conference on criminal justice reform. The audience listened intently as she spoke about the importance of accountability, the power of community, and the need for systemic change. "The fight for justice is never easy," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "But it's a fight worth having, because every step we take toward accountability brings us closer to a system that truly serves and protects everyone." As the audience rose to their feet in applause, Brianna felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced before. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had also been transformative. She had faced the system's darkest corners and emerged stronger, more determined than ever to be a force for change. And while the fight was far from over, Brianna Milton knew one thing for certain: justice would prevail, one case at a time.